Our final word tonight is a kick and a take. That's a fusion of my take and KICC's kicker. Fellow Kenyans, the kicker and the take contend that Kenya has just had a great moment on the international platform. The inaugural Africa Climate Summit was, without doubt, a great moment for Kenya.
Indeed, for 3 days, huge international headlines came out of the Kenyatta International Convention Center, KICC, in Nairobi, where African countries gathered to write a chapter in the complex and evolving story of global climate change. And it was a proud moment for Kenya as the hosting of the summit manifested a high sense of organizational resources that ranged from persons, venues, and equipment that made the great conversation possible.
And sharing in the pride of the country was President William Ruto, who, as the host, was the center of the activities at the KICC. Across the 3 days, the president made many trips to the podium to deliver one speech after the other. And that iconic closing ceremony walk, he led African leaders in reading the Nairobi Declaration. President Ruto emerged not just as the host, but also the spokesperson of the African leaders and the voice of the Africa Climate Summit.
The good feel was unmistakable. The president and the country were the center of a critical global conversation of a kind Kenyans have not had in recent times. The summit was a much welcome, elevated pedestal, not just for the country to add its voice to the climate change discourse, but also to take a break from a prelude of much lower standards.
Fellow Kenyans, there is no debate about the last 4 days. We looked good, we sounded good, and arguably, we took our rightful place in the hearts and minds of many, and at the high table community of nations. Deep down as Kenyans, we know we are made for such great moments, and we know that the Africa Climate Summit was one such moment that left us feeling good.
Due to pragmatic leadership by President William Ruto, Kenya is now respected, not just in Africa, but in the entire world. And we want to say we are proud that African leaders have identified President William Ruto as a leader who will lead this continent to be respected by the rest of the world. And the outcome of the Africa Climate Summit under President William Ruto is the first step of our continent to be heard and respected in the world stage. There is strength in unity. Our president has successfully united Africa to speak in one voice.
Now, the great feeling is here, but just how long shall Kenya sustain it? First, let us put to context what was right and great about the last 4 days at the halls of KICC. At the halls of the KICC, the Kenya of old, and we mean that Kenya that played in the heavyweight division of the global diplomacy, was making a return. This is where we used to punch, and make no mistake, it never even felt like we were punching above our weight.
Indeed, diplomatic observers have for long regarded Kenya as a critical player in the region and the continent. Whether you date this as far back as the years of the Cold War or fast-track it to the decades of civil wars around us, there was a time our voice on the diplomatic podium counted. South Sudan as a nation is territorial evidence of what Kenya was once capable of. The entire peace process that led to the formation of Africa's newest country, South Sudan, was midwifed by Kenya, during the reigns of both President Daniel Arap Moi and later President Mwai Kibaki.
Now, our second and third presidents energetically guided their governments, diplomats, and special envoys through big-time diplomatic engagements on both the regional and continental stage. There was a time the entire transitional government of Somalia was operating out of Kenya. The Somali Transitional Parliament, for example, held its sessions in Eldoret and what is now the Multimedia University here in Nairobi. And all the while, their president and even his rivals operated around some of Nairobi's suburbs.
Now, we make reference to that history for one reason, and that is the statesmanship that went into making Kenya a player of the big leagues. Diplomacy was then, as is today, a game of the big boys. And I don't mean gender here. And with the Climate Change Summit, the first step towards the big stage might just have been made. And onus now falls on President Ruto to complete the thread.
On the stage at the KICC, President Ruto, without doubt, impressed his peers that included some of Africa's longest-serving heads of state and government. He took the battle to the Western powers as he eloquently articulated the African argument for reforming of the global financial system. The delivery was firm, persuasive, and statesmanlike. The tone was earnest, respectful, and most certainly earned the attention of his audience. Let's face it, climate change is a big league affair.
Indeed it is. Climate change also belongs to the arena of high ideals, for which President Ruto acquitted himself well at the KICC. But for us to sustain the good feel of the 3 days at the KICC, our national discourse too must start embracing higher ideals in tone, manner, and subject. We mentioned the lowly prelude to the Nairobi summit. Not too long ago, we were snarling at each other and pleading with the international community to come and help us resolve some domestic quarrels. At the KICC, we put on a great show as a country, and in a manner that must have confounded close observers of our ways.
And so tonight, we persuade that the good show must continue, and that great feeling should, as a national endeavor, be sustained. And the duty of leading that endeavor falls squarely on President William Ruto, who should now help elevate the quality of our national discourse to match the high ideals for which we are now known after the impressive hosting of the Africa Climate Summit. The KICC Summit should not be seen as our proverbial Sunday best, but as part of our everyday wear as Kenyans. We are capable of good and the great, both abroad and at home.
On the national scene, Kenya is still reeling from a divisive aftermath of an election held more than a year ago. The journey towards healing is on course, but can be fast-tracked by a KICC-like higher ideals endeavor. For one, the president must now firmly step forward and assume his rightful place as a symbol of national unity, in line with Article 131(1)(e) of the Constitution of Kenya, 2010.
Indeed, about 16 years ago, in his days as member of the ODM Pentagon, the then Member of Parliament for Eldoret North, William Ruto, had some weighty advice for his party boss and now political opponent, Raila Odinga. Speaking at the Kasarani Gymnasium, he famously reminded Odinga that to conduct an orchestra, one must turn their back against the crowd. Years later, we find this advice rather appropriate for now President Ruto.
Yes, to conduct the orchestra, the president must turn his back against the crowd. If Kenyans are loving the tunes coming out of the KICC, it is because President Ruto's back was turned away from the crowd.
At the KICC, President Ruto was set free from acidic introductions and local political blood baying. And he came through for one of Kenya's proudest moments as assertively introduced himself to the stage of the big diplomacy and higher ideals.
And it took his own 18-year-old advice. To conduct an orchestra, one must turn their back against the crowd. That is our fusion of the take and the kicker.